Clara stood by the tree, her fingers gently brushing the faded branches, and a thought crossed her mind. Her last mistake was giving me this old Christmas tree as an inheritance. She thought it was just a worthless relic, but it was the key to everything. She never knew it, but by doing that, she handed me my fortune. And now, everything she built on greed is crumbling. Hi, lovely soul. I am glad to have you here. If you're enjoying this story, a like or subscribe would mean the world to me. It helps me keep sharing more heartfelt tales with you. And if you're up for it, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. It sure means a whole lot to me. Chapter 1. A Christmas of Loss and Betrayal. 1885. A cold winter's evening in England, the air crisp with the biting chill of December. The grand estate, nestled on the outskirts of London, stood silent beneath a blanket of snow. Its stone walls, once full of life and warmth, now felt like a distant memory, their coldness mirroring the emptiness within. The manor was grand in stature, yet the silence inside was suffocating. The heavy drapes, drawn against the wintry gloom, failed to block the cold that seeped in from the outside. But the greater chill came from within, the chill of a broken family and a lost inheritance. In the drawing room of the estate, a single light flickered beside the hearth, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. The Christmas tree, towering and forlorn, stood in the corner, its decorations faded and tired, much like the family that once had gathered around it. The ornaments that hung upon its branches were chipped and dull, the once vibrant colors now muted by years of neglect. And beneath it all, the girl, now a young woman, stared at the tree, her heart heavy with sorrow. Her name was Clara, though she had not been called that in years, not by her stepmother, not by anyone who still remained in the house. Her mother, the woman who had given her the gift of life and love, was long gone, taken too early by a cruel twist of fate. And with her mother's death, her father had fallen into the arms of another, a woman whose heart was cold as winter's frost. The stepmother, the woman who now ruled the estate with a heartless grip, had stripped away any semblance of comfort, leaving only the memories of a life that could never be reclaimed. Clara's sobs were quiet, barely audible, as she leaned against the tree, her fingers brushing the worn branches. Her chest felt tight with the weight of the loss, not just the loss of her mother, but the loss of the future she had once hoped for. The inheritance her father had left behind was nothing more than a distant dream, stolen by the woman who now claimed everything as her own. The estate, the wealth, everything was now hers, leaving Clara with only the Christmas tree. The tree, though it had once held joy and light, now seemed a cruel joke. The stepmother had given her nothing but this. She could still hear her words echoing in her mind, the words that had cut through her like ice. "You should be grateful, Clara," she had said that morning, her voice dripping with mockery. "This tree is the last thing your dead mother ever left you." It had been no more than a week since her father had passed away, but already the stepmother had consolidated her power. Clara had watched helplessly as the woman took control, not just of the household, but of every aspect of their lives. The will had been read with icy efficiency, and Clara had received her inheritance, or rather, the lack of it. The stepmother had taken everything, the land, the wealth, the jewels. Nothing had been left for Clara, except the tree, the last remaining symbol of a life that had been hers. The Christmas tree stood as a bitter reminder of what could have been. Each ornament on its branches seemed to mock her, each faded piece a reflection of her mother's once vibrant love and the brokenness that now defined Clara's world. She had never felt more alone. The warmth of the hearth seemed distant, as though the fire itself had abandoned her. Her mother's legacy, her father's wealth, her future all taken away in the blink of an eye. Clara's sobs grew quieter, her tears now mixing with the snowflakes outside that drifted past the window. She closed her eyes for a moment, wishing that she could remember the warmth of her mother's embrace, that she could forget the harshness of the woman who now called herself her stepmother. But the cruel reality of her situation could not be erased. She would never again know the love that had once filled this house. She would never again feel the joy of Christmas the way she had as a child. The door to the room creaked open, and Clara stiffened. She knew who it was before the woman even spoke. "You're still standing here, Clara?" The stepmother's voice was sharp, icy, her tone filled with disdain. The woman stepped into the room, her presence like a shadow that darkened the space even further. She was tall and elegant, her figure draped in a velvet gown that seemed to absorb all the warmth in the room. Her hair was perfectly styled, her face a mask of cold indifference. There was nothing about her that suggested warmth or kindness, nothing that made Clara feel anything but dread. The stepmother's eyes fell on the Christmas tree, and a thin smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Still mourning, are we? It's been days. You would think you'd have come to terms with it by now." She walked across the room, her footsteps deliberate, as if she were accustomed to holding dominion over the space. Clara remained silent, her eyes fixed on the tree. She couldn't bring herself to look at her stepmother. She could feel the woman's eyes on her, studying her, judging her. "This tree, Clara," the stepmother continued, her voice taking on a mocking edge, "it's the last thing your mother left you. It's all you're entitled to now." She took a long pause, as if savoring the cruelty of her words. "Be grateful." Clara's hands clenched into fists, but she said nothing. There was no point in arguing with a woman who would never understand. The stepmother was too consumed by her own greed to care about anyone else. All Clara had left was this tree, and she would not let the woman see how much it pained her. The stepmother circled around the tree, inspecting the ornaments with an air of detached amusement. "What a sad thing it is, this tree, so old, so tired. Just like you, Clara." She smirked as she turned toward the door. "A fitting inheritance, don't you think?" Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to keep her composure. She wanted to scream, to tell the woman what she truly felt, but it was useless. The stepmother had already claimed everything, and Clara had nothing left to fight for. She watched as the woman turned to leave, her footsteps growing quieter as she moved out of the room. As the door closed, Clara's gaze returned to the tree. The ornaments shimmered faintly in the low light. Chapter 2. The first sign of the tragedy came in the form of a simple letter unopened, its contents just a vague suggestion of what was to come. Clara had never imagined that the letter would carry such news. It was one of those letters that arrived on an ordinary day, slipping unnoticed into the flow of life. But soon, that ordinary day would become the turning point of her life, the day when everything changed. Her father had been ill for some time, though none had anticipated the quickness with which his condition would deteriorate. Clara had always known him to be a man of strength, both physically and emotionally. His presence had filled the rooms of the manor, and his laughter had once been the heart of their family. Even in the shadow of her mother's death, Clara had held on to the memory of her father's enduring love and support. But, alas, fate is cruel, and life is often unpredictable. It was the middle of November when Clara found her father lying in his bed, pale and still, his breath shallow and labored. The warmth that had once radiated from him was gone, leaving behind only the faintest trace of life. His illness had taken him quickly, and now, as Clara stood at his bedside, she could hardly bring herself to believe that the man who had been her protector and her strength was gone forever. Her heart shattered in that moment, not only for the loss of her father, but also for the realization that everything was about to change. The house, which had once been filled with love and laughter, now felt cold and empty, as though it too mourned the passing of its master. Clara had always believed that her father's love for her was unconditional. Despite the coldness of her stepmother, her father had always shown affection, even if it had been brief or distant at times. He had always been the buffer between Clara and the harshness of the world. But now, with his death, there would be no one left to protect her. The days that followed were filled with mourning, but the true shock came with the reading of the will. Clara, still grieving, had no idea that the real pain was yet to come. She had held on to the hope that her father would have left her something, a token of his love, perhaps, or a recognition of her struggles, something to remind her that she had been his daughter, loved and cherished despite everything. But when the lawyer entered the room and opened the will, it quickly became apparent that this hope was in vain. The will was read in a cold, mechanical tone, the words spilling out with a chilling finality. The estate, the wealth, and all the holdings were to be passed to none other than her stepmother. The reading was almost a formality, and Clara could feel the weight of the lawyer's eyes on her as he glanced nervously at her. Her stepmother, sitting across the room with an unreadable expression on her face, showed no emotion. Clara felt a sharp pain in her chest. She had expected the inheritance to be divided, but it had all gone to her stepmother. Every single piece of it. Not a penny, not a piece of land, not even a token from her father had been left for her. When the lawyer finished reading, he looked at Clara with a faint expression of pity, and as per the instructions in the will, he said, The only bequest to Miss Clara is the Christmas tree that once belonged to her late mother. Clara's heart sank. The Christmas tree, the tree that had once been a symbol of her mother's kindness, the tree that had been a gift from the Duke, given in gratitude for her mother's selflessness. And now it was the only thing she was left with, an empty reminder of a life that had once been filled with love and warmth. Her stepmother smiled coldly, as if she had expected this outcome all along. There was no hint of surprise, no hint of remorse. The tree, which had once symbolized the kindness of Clara's mother, now seemed like an empty gesture, a symbol of all that Clara had lost. Clara felt the walls closing in around her as her stepmother's cold gaze settled upon her. It was as though her father had disappeared entirely, leaving only his wife's grasping hands to take everything he had left behind. Clara could feel her throat tighten with a mixture of anger and sorrow. How could her father have done this? How could he have left her with nothing but the very thing her stepmother would never care for? The betrayal was more than she could bear. In that moment, Clara understood the extent of her stepmother's cruelty. She had been waiting for this day. She had known that Clara would receive nothing. She had known that the inheritance would pass to her alone. And now, as Clara stood there, holding nothing but the memory of a family that had once been hers, the weight of her loss felt unbearable. Her father, the man who had once promised to protect her, had left her with nothing but a cold, indifferent stepmother and an empty inheritance. Clara wanted to scream, to demand some recognition, some acknowledgement of the love and devotion she had given, but she knew it would do no good. Her father's death had left her with nothing but shadows. As Clara stood in that cold, silent room, the full weight of the moment settled in. She could feel the tears rising in her throat, but she forced them back. She had to remain strong. But how could she? How could she remain strong when everything she had ever known, everything she had ever loved, had been taken from her? Her father's love had been replaced by the stepmother's greed. The wealth of the estate had been claimed by a woman who cared only for power and control, and Clara was left with nothing, no love, no wealth, no future. And yet, as Clara stared at the Christmas tree, the only thing that had been left to her, she felt something stirring inside her. It was a strange feeling, one that had lain dormant for so long. It was hope, a small, fragile hope, but it was there. She couldn't allow her father's death to be the end of her story. She couldn't allow her stepmother's greed to define her future. Clara clenched her fists at her sides, feeling the sting of betrayal, but also something stronger, determination. The pain of the loss still gripped her heart, but Clara knew that she would no longer be a victim. She would take control of her future. She would fight for what was rightfully hers, and she would not let her stepmother's cruelty go unchallenged. The battle had just begun. Chapter 3. It was a winter's evening, some years before Clara's father had passed, when the woman had first entered their lives. Clara had been no more than a young girl at the time, her world still unbroken by the cruelty that would soon become commonplace. She had watched as her father, once so full of love for her mother, turned his affections toward this new woman. Her stepmother, tall and striking, had entered the estate like a figure from a portrait, her beauty cold, her movements calculated, her smile a mere facade of warmth. At first, Clara had been charmed by the new arrival, dazzled by her elegance and refined manners. But it did not take long for the true nature of the woman to reveal itself. The warmth that Clara had once known in the home evaporated the moment the stepmother set foot in the manor. Her stepmother was a woman of ambition. She had no interest in the quiet comforts of a family life. Her desire was for power, and she knew that her marriage to Clara's father would secure her place in society. The wealth of the estate was hers for the taking, and the girl was nothing more than an obstacle in her path. Clara's father, blinded by his infatuation, could not see the change that was taking place under his own roof. He failed to notice the way his new wife began to shape the house to her will, slowly replacing the old family traditions with her own cold, calculated rules. As the years passed, Clara's life became one of hardship, though she had never known it could be any other way. Her stepmother was cold, her affection rare, and her treatment of Clara even rarer. The once warm halls of the manor became filled with whispers of commands and sharp rebukes. Clara's very presence seemed to irritate her stepmother, as if her existence itself were an affront to the new order she had established in the household. The girl found herself relegated to the shadows of the house, her once prominent place at the family table now non-existent. The warmth that had filled their home when her mother was alive was replaced by icy glares and hollow silence. Clara became accustomed to these silences, learning early to keep her head down and her thoughts to herself. There was no point in trying to appeal to her stepmother's sense of kindness, for kindness was a trait the woman had long since abandoned. The stepmother's cruelty was not always blatant. It was subtle, lurking behind every action, every word. Clara was constantly reminded of her place, always just outside of the family, always the second-class citizen in her own home. Her stepmother often praised her own beauty, her own accomplishments, and never once acknowledged the girl's struggles. Clara had once been full of dreams, a bright-eyed child who believed in love and happiness. But as she grew older, those dreams slowly withered. Her spirit had been stifled, and her once hopeful heart had been hardened by the daily cruelty of living under her stepmother's rule. Clara became adept at hiding her emotions, burying them deep within, where no one could see them. She learned to smile when it was expected, to speak when spoken to, and to remain silent when it was not. Her stepmother had no use for a daughter who was not useful, and Clara soon became nothing more than a shadow in the house, a reminder of the past that her stepmother had no interest in remembering. But it was not just the cruel treatment that defined Clara's existence under her stepmother's rule, it was her stepmother's unrelenting greed. From the moment she entered the family, she had set her sights on the estate and all that it offered. She had no interest in being a mother or a matriarch. She sought only power and wealth. Clara's father, already a man of considerable wealth, had been easy prey for the stepmother. He had been so blinded by his new wife's beauty and charm that he had allowed her to take control of everything. Her stepmother's desire to gain complete control over the estate began as a quiet ambition, but soon it became her sole focus. She had spent years carefully manipulating her father, ingraining herself as the central figure in the household. Her subtle machinations had slowly begun to erase the old ways of the estate, replacing them with her own. The servants who once served the family with loyalty were now at her beck and call. The family traditions, the quiet joys of simple living, were replaced by opulence, extravagance, and an obsession with appearances. Clara could see the toll this had taken on her father. He had once been kind, generous, a man who took pride in his estate and the legacy of his ancestors. But under the influence of his new wife, he had become a mere puppet, his strings pulled by her greedy hands. Her stepmother's control over the estate grew with each passing year, and Clara was left without the means to fight back. There was no one to turn to, no ally in sight. Her father had no more strength to defend her. His attention was consumed by his wife's demands, her desire for more and more. And Clara, the girl who had once been the heart of the family, was pushed further and further into the margins of the house. She had nothing, not even the attention or affection of her father, who had become a mere shadow of the man he once was. Despite the coldness that surrounded her, Clara still found herself clinging to the memories of her mother. Her mother, a woman of great kindness and compassion, had been loved by all who knew her. She had helped the poor, the needy, and the lost, offering comfort and solace to those who had no one else to turn to. Clara often wondered what her mother would have said about the life she was now leading. How would her mother have responded to the cruelty that her stepmother had inflicted upon her? How would her mother have dealt with the overwhelming greed that had consumed her father's household? Clara dreamed of a time when her mother's legacy would be honored. She could still remember her mother's warm smile, the gentle touch of her hand. Clara knew that her mother would never have let such cruelty stand. She would have fought, she would have cared, she would have made sure that love was the guiding force in their family. But now, Clara was left alone to face the reality of her life. The once hopeful girl had been replaced by someone hardened and cautious, someone who knew that there was no place for kindness in a world ruled by greed and ambition. Clara longed for her mother's strength, for the warmth of her mother's love, but she knew that she could not bring her mother back. Her stepmother's coldness had killed that hope, replacing it with a deep, aching sense of loss. As Clara stood in the cold drawing room, the memory of her mother's love seemed like a distant dream. Her stepmother's rise to power had changed everything, and now the estate was hers. Clara, once the beloved daughter, was now an invisible figure in her own home. The legacy of kindness, compassion, and love that her mother had left behind seemed like something from another time, another life. And yet, in Clara's heart, that legacy still burned brightly, a flicker of light in the darkness of the cold, cruel world her stepmother had created. But as the night wore on, Clara realized that though she may have lost much, she still had something precious: her mother's spirit, her kindness, and her love. The battle for the estate and for her future had only just begun. In her heart, Clara knew that one day her mother's legacy would be restored, and in the process, her stepmother would pay the price for the cruelty she had inflicted. Chapter 4. The winter had settled in heavily that year, as it always did, blanketing the land in a cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of the estate. The halls of the manor were still and silent, the air thick with the weight of memories long gone. Yet, despite the oppressive quiet that had come to fill the rooms, Clara could still hear the echoes of the past, faint whispers that tugged at her heart, reminding her of a time when the estate had been alive with love. Clara stood by the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she looked out into the snow-covered grounds. It was late in the evening, and the mansion was bathed in the pale light of the moon, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. As she stared into the darkness beyond, her mind wandered back to the past, back to the days when she was a child, when Christmas had meant something far more than coldness and cruelty. Her mother had been everything to her. She had been a beacon of warmth in a world that often felt dark and unforgiving. Clara could still remember her mother's gentle hands, the softness of her voice, and the way she always made everything seem right, even when the world around them seemed wrong. Her mother had been a woman of remarkable kindness, a woman who had opened her heart to anyone in need, no matter their station in life. The girl's thoughts drifted to the countless memories of her mother's acts of charity. Her mother had not been a woman of great wealth, though they lived in a respectable estate. They were not too rich. Yet, despite their modest means, her mother had always found a way to help others. Whether it was giving a meal to a hungry traveler or offering shelter to a family in need, her mother's kindness had been boundless. Clara remembered how her mother would always say, "It is not the wealth we have that defines us, but the way we choose to share it with others." Her mother had lived by this mantra, and it had earned her the admiration of all who knew her. People from the village would speak of her often, recounting stories of her generosity and selflessness. And though her mother's health had not been the strongest, she had always found the energy to give, to help, and to make the lives of those around her better. Clara had often watched her mother with a sense of awe, wondering how someone could give so freely without ever expecting anything in return. It had been a rare and beautiful thing, her mother's willingness to pour out kindness without hesitation. Clara had tried, in her own small way, to emulate her mother's example, but it had never felt as natural, as pure, as her mother's boundless love for everyone she met. It was one such act of kindness that had led to the Duke's arrival in their lives, a man who, though wealthy beyond measure, had found himself in a dire situation. The Duke had been traveling through the countryside, his carriage stuck in the snow during a particularly fierce winter storm. It was Clara's mother who had come upon him, stranded and helpless, with no one to assist him. Though the family was not affluent, Clara's mother had offered the Duke not just shelter from the storm, but her warmth, her kindness, and a simple meal. The Duke had been moved by her generosity, not just because of the kindness she had shown him, but because she had given without asking for anything in return. She had not asked his name, had not cared for his title or his wealth. She had simply seen a man in need and had offered him what she could. The Duke, once he had regained his composure and the storm had passed, had promised her that he would repay her kindness in any way he could. But Clara's mother humbly refused. She did not need repayment, she had said. The warmth of the moment had been enough. But the Duke, insistent and deeply moved by her grace, left them with a gift, a symbol of his gratitude, something that would forever remind them of their encounter. That Christmas, the Duke sent them a magnificent tree, a grand, tall Christmas tree, adorned with ornaments, its fragrance filling the house. It was rich in symbolism, a humble yet meaningful gesture from a man who could have given them much more, but had instead given them something far more precious, a reminder that kindness could transcend all boundaries. The tree had become a cherished symbol of her mother's generosity, and though it was not a grand gift in terms of material wealth, it had been enough. It had been a gift of the heart, a symbol of the profound connection between two souls who had met by chance and had left each other changed forever. As Clara stood by the window, the memory of that tree, a gift that had once brought such joy, came flooding back. It had stood in their drawing room for years, a symbol of her mother's spirit. But now, as she stood before the faded, withered tree that had been left to her, Clara could not shake the feeling that it mocked her. The tree, once so vibrant and full of life, now seemed a hollow echo of a time long gone. The ornaments, once sparkling with the warmth of love and laughter, now appeared dim and dull. and the scent of pine that had once filled the house with memories of family gatherings was now replaced by the cold, lifeless air of an estate ruled by a woman who cared only for power and wealth. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the rough texture of the ornament that hung on the tree, the one that had once symbolized her mother's unselfish nature. The stepmother had taken the wealth. The stepmother had taken the love. The stepmother had taken everything except for this tree, and now Clara was left with nothing but the ghost of a gift, a memory of a time when kindness and love had filled the house. Chapter 5. The days following her father's death were like a blur to Clara. The house, once filled with the warmth of family, was now cold and silent. Each room, though grand, felt like a prison. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of her stepmother's growing power and control, and Clara had become little more than a ghost in her own home. But amidst the grief and the overwhelming sense of loss, something stirred inside Clara, something she hadn't felt in years. A flicker of hope, tiny yet undeniable, began to kindle within her heart. It all started with the tree. The Christmas tree, once a symbol of family and joy, now stood in the corner of the room like a hollow reminder of the life Clara had once known. The ornaments, faded and chipped, were no longer the vibrant symbols of holiday cheer. Instead, they seemed like relics of a time long past, when things had been simpler, when her mother had been alive. Yet, despite the sorrow that clung to it, Clara couldn't bring herself to let go of the tree. It was all she had left of her mother, the only piece of her mother's legacy that the stepmother disdainfully let her have. One evening, as the shadows grew long and the fire in the hearth flickered low, Clara found herself standing before the tree again, lost in her thoughts. Her stepmother had long since retired to her rooms, leaving Clara alone in the drawing room, where the tree still stood in the corner, its fading beauty somehow still comforting. She ran her fingers along the rough bark of the tree, the pine needles brittle beneath her touch. Her mother's love seemed to seep from every branch, and for the briefest moment, Clara could almost imagine her mother standing beside her, warm and alive. But that illusion shattered the moment Clara's eyes caught something odd, a glimmer, faint and subtle, among the ornaments. The light from the fireplace cast a soft glow over the tree, and it was then that Clara noticed the ornament that had not caught her eye before. It was small, almost hidden amongst the branches. At first, she thought it was just another ornament, a mere decoration with no real significance. But as her gaze lingered on it, Clara felt a pull, an instinctive tug in her chest, as if the ornament were calling to her. Without thinking, she reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the delicate ornament, Clara felt a strange warmth spread through her body. It was as though the ornament itself was alive, responding to her touch in a way that was almost magical. She carefully lifted it from the tree, feeling a rush of excitement and unease. The ornament was unlike any she had seen before. It was intricate, with delicate engravings swirling around its surface. The metal was cold, but as Clara turned it in her hands, she noticed something hidden within something small, tucked away inside the ornament itself. She held it closer, her breath catching in her throat as she saw it. A tiny key, exquisitely crafted, its silver surface gleaming faintly in the firelight. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she examined the key. It was small, delicate, and beautifully made, nothing like the simple decorations that adorned the tree. It was a key, she realized, though to what, she couldn't say. The engraving on its surface was unlike anything she had ever seen. There were intricate patterns, shapes that seemed to shift and move as she tilted the key in the light. For a moment, Clara wondered if it was just a trinket, a piece of decoration that had been hidden away for no reason at all. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. There was something more to it, something significant. She couldn't explain why, but Clara felt an undeniable pull to the key. It was as if it held the answers to questions she hadn't even known to ask. She could feel its weight in her hand, a weight far greater than its size suggested. It was as if the key were part of something much larger, something that had been hidden from her for far too long. Her thoughts turned to her mother. Clara remembered the stories her mother had told her as a child, stories of kindness and generosity, of a world that could be shaped by love and selflessness. She remembered how her mother had helped so many people, strangers and neighbors alike, and how those people had never forgotten her. Clara had always believed her mother's kindness would be remembered, that somehow it would shape the course of her own life. And now, as she looked at the key, she felt a strange sense of recognition. Was this key somehow connected to her mother's past? Clara recalled the letters her mother had kept, letters filled with details of people her mother had helped, stories of gratitude from those who had been touched by her mother's generosity. Could this key be a part of one of those stories? Could it be the key to something her mother had left behind, something that Clara was now meant to find? Clara's mind raced as she sat down at her mother's old writing desk, the key still clutched tightly in her hand. The warmth of the fire and the quiet of the room surrounded her as she began to sift through the old letters and journals that had once belonged to her mother. She had never paid much attention to them before, after all. They had seemed like relics of a time that no longer mattered. But tonight, as she held the key, they seemed to take on a new significance. There had to be something in these pages, something that would explain what she had found. As she flipped through the faded pages, Clara's eyes caught on a familiar name, the Duke. Her mother had written about him several times. The Duke had been someone her mother had helped during a time of great need, a man who had found himself in a desperate situation. Clara had heard the story before, but now, with the key in her hand, the details seemed to leap off the pages with new meaning. The Duke, it seemed, had been eternally grateful for her mother's kindness. In one letter, her mother had written about how the Duke had promised to repay her for the help she had given him. At the time, Clara had assumed the promise had been a mere formality, an empty gesture. But now, with the key in her hand, Clara began to wonder if that promise had been more than just words. In the journals, her mother had mentioned a hidden vault, a place where wealth had been stored, waiting for the right time to be claimed. Clara's heart raced as she read the passage. The Duke had promised to repay her mother's kindness with a gift, but it seemed that the true gift had been something far greater, a treasure hidden away, waiting to be unlocked. And now, the key, the very key Clara held in her hand, was the key to that vault. Clara's mind was filled with questions. What exactly had the Duke hidden away? Why had her mother never claimed it? And more importantly, why was it being passed on to her now? It seemed too incredible to believe. Could it be true? Could the key really open a vault filled with wealth, just as her mother had hinted in her journals? Clara's pulse quickened as she thought of all that could be waiting for her. But there was something deeper at play here. This wasn't just about wealth. The key was a part of her mother's legacy, a legacy that Clara had been denied by her stepmother's greed. The tree, the ornament, the key, all of it seemed to be leading Clara towards something far greater than just riches. It was leading her to the truth, to reclaiming what had been lost. For the first time since her father's death, Clara felt something other than grief. She felt purpose. The realization settled in her heart like a weight, but this time the weight was not heavy with sorrow. It was heavy with possibility. The key was hers, and with it she could unlock not just a vault, but a future, her future. A future where she would no longer be at the mercy of her stepmother's cruelty. This was her chance to reclaim what had been stolen from her, to restore her mother's legacy, and to take back the inheritance that was rightfully hers. Clara stood up, the key still in her hand, and walked toward the door. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, Clara felt ready. The key was more than just a trinket, it was her ticket to a new life. And with it, she would face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to reclaim her mother's legacy and secure her place in the world. Chapter 6. The winter's chill had settled deeper into the stone walls of the manor, making the grand estate feel even more imposing. The distant wind howled through the empty corridors, and Clara felt it creeping into her soul. It was an unsettling sound, one that reminded her of the coldness of her situation. The walls that once offered her protection now seemed like prisons, their cold surfaces reflecting the cruel hands that had taken over the estate. Her stepmother's control had become absolute, and Clara had never felt more like an outsider in her own home. But something inside Clara had begun to change. She was no longer the meek girl who had once cowered in the presence of her stepmother's harsh words. She had found something hidden within her mother's legacy, within the Christmas tree, within the tiny key that gleamed in her hand. It was as if a spark had been lit within her, a sense of purpose that had been long buried under the weight of her stepmother's tyranny. Clara now knew that she had the power to change her future, and that power lay in the key, her key to a destiny that had been unjustly taken from her. It did not take long for Clara's stepmother to notice the change in her. The girl had begun to spend more time alone in her mother's old room, poring over the journals and letters her mother had left behind. There were moments when Clara would leave the house entirely, venturing into the surrounding woods or the small village nearby, her mind whirling with the possibilities the key had opened. Clara's every step, every action, had become more deliberate, more purposeful. Her stepmother, ever watchful, had begun to notice these subtle changes. The girl had never been one to make waves, always content to stay in the background. But now, there was a fire in her that couldn't be ignored. At first, the stepmother had dismissed it, convinced that Clara's emotional state was simply a result of the grief over her father's death. But soon, as Clara's resolve grew stronger, the stepmother's suspicion began to take root. She could no longer ignore the quiet determination in Clara's eyes, the way she seemed to hold herself differently, as if she were preparing for something. It was in the dead of night, just days after Clara had begun her search for the vault, that the key opened, that the stepmother decided to confront her. Clara had been walking the halls of the manor, lost in thought, when the stepmother's cold voice rang out from the shadows. "What are you up to, Clara?" The stepmother's tone was laced with suspicion. Clara turned slowly, startled by the sudden question, but she quickly masked the surprise with a calm composure she had not known she possessed. "Nothing," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil that churned inside her. The stepmother's eyes narrowed. She was a woman who had spent years reading the subtle movements of others, and she was beginning to sense that something was afoot. "Nothing? Or perhaps you've decided that you are entitled to more than just a tree?" Clara's heart raced at the mention of the tree. The key, hidden away within its ornament, had been the only inheritance she had received, yet it was no mere trinket. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest, urging her to take action. But she had not yet revealed the secret to anyone, not even to her stepmother. The time was not yet right. But Clara knew she had no choice. The stepmother had already begun to tighten her grip on the estate, and Clara's growing resolve could not be ignored for long. The stepmother took a step forward, her eyes glinting with a cold, calculating look. "You think you deserve more than your mother's legacy, more than that wretched tree." Her voice dripped with venom, her words laced with disdain. "You are nothing more than a girl who has been given too much. Don't forget your place, Clara. You have no right to claim anything more." Clara felt the sting of her stepmother's words, but they were no longer enough to deter her. She had suffered under the woman's cruelty for far too long, and now she understood something her stepmother had failed to see. Clara had the key to something far greater than the stepmother's wealth or power. It was the key to her mother's legacy, a legacy that could not be stolen or erased by the greed of another. But the stepmother was relentless. Her manipulations knew no bounds, and her tactics were as cruel as ever. Over the next few days, she began to subtly undermine Clara's newfound resolve, using every opportunity to make the girl feel worthless. She would mock Clara's every effort, dismissing her ideas and belittling her aspirations. "You still think you're worthy of anything more than this?" the stepmother would sneer as she passed Clara in the hall. "You're nothing. You're just a girl who thinks she's entitled to wealth that doesn't belong to her." But Clara would not allow herself to be broken. Each cruel remark from her stepmother only strengthened her resolve. The girl had learned long ago that her stepmother's cruelty was a reflection of her own insecurities and fears. She was desperate to keep Clara in a state of submission, to make her believe that she was unworthy of anything more. But Clara would not let her. Clara began to spend more time in her mother's old study, poring over the journals and letters that had been hidden away for so long. Each page she turned revealed more about her mother's generosity, her kindness, and the promise made by the Duke. The more Clara read, the more she understood that her mother's legacy was far greater than she had realized. The tree, the ornament, and the key were all part of something much larger, a story that had been set in motion long before Clara had ever known. She began to piece together the history of the key. The Duke, who had promised her mother his wealth in return for her kindness, had hidden it away for a reason. The vault it opened was not just a treasure trove of riches, it was a testament to her mother's generosity, a legacy that had been meant for Clara all along. The key had been passed down from her mother, and now it was hers to claim. Clara knew that this was her moment. She would not allow her stepmother to control her any longer. She would not let her stepmother's greed define her future. The stepmother's attempts to manipulate Clara were becoming more frequent, but Clara was no longer afraid. Each time the stepmother tried to undermine her, Clara grew stronger. She had the key, and with it, she had the power to change her future. She knew the time had come to take action. One evening, as the stepmother lingered near the drawing room, watching Clara with cold eyes, the girl made her decision. She would no longer wait for her stepmother's approval. She would no longer be content with the scraps that had been left to her. The key, which had once seemed like a small trinket, now felt like the most powerful thing in the world. Clara knew that she had the right to reclaim what had been stolen from her. Her mother's legacy was hers to protect, and she would not let anyone stand in her way. Clara turned to face her stepmother, her eyes hard and resolute. "You've taken everything, but you will not take this," she said quietly, holding the key in her hand. The stepmother raised an eyebrow, but Clara could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had never expected Clara to fight back, and now that the girl had found her voice, the stepmother knew she was losing control. "I will find the vault," Clara continued, her voice steady. "And when I do, I will take what is rightfully mine. You will not stand in my way." The stepmother's face twisted with anger and confusion, but Clara stood firm, holding the key out in front of her. The stepmother's power, once so absolute, was slipping away. "I will use this wealth not for myself, but to honor my mother's memory," Clara declared. "I will restore what you have tried to destroy." And with that, Clara turned and walked out of the room, the key clenched tightly in her hand. The stepmother could no longer control her. Clara had made her decision, and nothing would stop her from reclaiming the inheritance that was hers by right. Chapter 7. The air was thick with tension as Clara stood in the center of the drawing room, the weight of her mother's legacy pressing down on her chest. The key, small yet heavy with meaning, rested in her palm, its cool surface a constant reminder of the promises long unfulfilled. Her heart raced with a mix of anticipation and dread. This moment had been a long time coming, and yet, as she prepared for the final confrontation, Clara felt the familiar sting of fear clawing at her resolve. Her stepmother was not one to be easily intimidated, but Clara had come to understand something her stepmother could not her own strength. For years, she had been told she was nothing. For years, she had lived under the oppressive shadow of a woman who valued only wealth and control. But now, Clara was no longer the passive, obedient girl she had once been. She had the key to a future she was finally ready to claim, and no one, not even her stepmother, could take that from her. It was late in the evening when Clara entered the drawing room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The heavy curtains had been drawn back to allow the moonlight to spill into the room, casting pale, ethereal light across the worn furniture. Her stepmother was sitting by the fire, a glass of wine in her hand, her expression one of cold indifference as she gazed into the flames. Clara's steps were quiet, but there was no mistaking the purpose in her movements. The time had come. She could feel the heat of the fire, but it was the fire within her that fueled her determination. She would no longer be silenced. The moment Clara entered the room, her stepmother looked up, her eyes narrowing in a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The girl's posture was different now, straight, unwavering. The soft tremor in her voice that had once characterized every conversation was gone, replaced by a steely resolve that could not be ignored. "Clara," her stepmother began, her voice dripping with the same coldness it always did. "What is it now? Have you come to cry over your father's death again?" She placed her glass down on the table, her expression a mixture of disdain and bemusement. Clara stood still, her gaze fixed firmly on her stepmother. "No," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "I've come to claim what is rightfully mine." Her stepmother's lips twisted into a smile, but it was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a woman who believed herself to be untouchable, a woman who had built her life on the suffering of others. "You are wasting your time, my dear," she said softly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "You've been left with nothing but a tree. That's all. Your father left you." Clara's heart beat faster as the words she had been holding in for so long rose to the surface. "It's not just a tree," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's a symbol of my mother's legacy, a legacy that was always meant to be mine." The stepmother's eyes narrowed further, the facade of control she had so carefully cultivated beginning to crack. "Your mother's legacy," she repeated, her voice tinged with incredulity. "You think this house, this estate, was meant for you? You think your mother's poor little tree means anything? It is nothing but a memory, an old trinket meant to remind you of your place." Clara stepped forward, her hand clenched around the key. "No, it is not a trinket," she said firmly. "It is the key to the future that my mother built for me, a future that you tried to steal." The stepmother's laughter was bitter, hollow. "And what do you intend to do with that key?" she asked, her voice full of mockery. "Do you honestly think that you, a mere girl, can claim what was never meant for you? Clara didn't flinch. She didn't need to explain herself any longer. She had already made up her mind. I'm going to open the vault, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. The vault that holds the wealth my mother was promised, the wealth you never knew about because you were too focused on your greed to see it, the wealth that is mine by right. Her stepmother's expression faltered for the first time. The mask of control slipped slightly, her lips parting as if searching for a response, but none came. Clara felt the power of her words settle in the room, heavy and undeniable. You think you can just walk in and claim it? The stepmother's voice was laced with venom, but Clara could hear the tremor of uncertainty beneath it. You think you can take everything I've worked for? Clara took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the key. You've worked to destroy everything that was good in this house, she said, her voice quiet but full of conviction. But I will not let you destroy my mother's legacy. Not anymore. Her stepmother stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You are nothing but a child, she spat, her face red with anger. You have no right to claim what isn't yours. Clara stood her ground, her eyes fixed firmly on her stepmother. The anger in her stepmother's eyes was palpable, but it only fueled Clara's determination. It is mine, Clara said, her voice unwavering, and I will claim it. The stepmother's face twisted in a mixture of fury and desperation. You think I will let you have it? You think I will stand by and watch you take everything from me? Before Clara could respond, her stepmother lunged toward her, grabbing at the key in Clara's hand. But Clara was faster. She jerked the key away, stepping back with a strength she had not known she possessed. Her stepmother's outstretched hand grasped at air, and for a brief moment, Clara saw the desperation in her stepmother's eyes. A woman who had spent her life taking what wasn't hers, now faced with losing everything she had so ruthlessly claimed. You won't stop me, Clara said firmly. You've already lost. The stepmother staggered backward, her face contorted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. For the first time, she seemed vulnerable, exposed. Clara could see it now. The woman who had once held all the power, the woman who had manipulated everyone in her path, was terrified. In that moment, Clara knew that the stepmother's reign had ended. The lies, the manipulation, the cruelty, it had all led to this. Her stepmother's own greed had blinded her, and now she was left with nothing. Clara moved swiftly, reaching for the drawer in her mother's old desk. The key was still clutched tightly in her hand. Her stepmother, still standing across the room, was frozen in place, watching with wide eyes as Clara unlocked the drawer. With trembling fingers, Clara opened the small compartment where the vault's location had been hidden for years. The stepmother took a step forward, her voice trembling with desperation. You can't do this. You have no idea what you're dealing with. But Clara was done listening. She had heard enough. She had spent too long under her stepmother's thumb, and now it was time to take back what was hers. She pulled out the old map her mother had hidden away, the map that led to the hidden vault. It was a map her stepmother had never known, about a map that would lead Clara to the wealth and legacy that had been promised to her mother all those years ago. With one last look at her stepmother, Clara turned toward the door, the map in hand, and the key still gleaming in her grasp. This is mine, she said softly, her voice steady. And you have no power here anymore. Her stepmother stood frozen, her mouth open in disbelief. She had lost, and Clara had won. As Clara stepped out into the cold night, the weight of the key in her hand felt lighter than it ever had before. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Clara felt certain of her victory. The vault awaited her, and with it, the future her mother had always dreamed of for her. The stepmother's reign was over, and Clara's journey had just begun. Chapter 8. The mansion, once darkened by the shadow of cruelty, now stood in the pale glow of a winter morning, the snow outside blanketing the estate in serene whiteness. Clara stood at the window of her mother's old study, looking out over the grounds. The map she had uncovered spread out on the desk before her. Her stepmother's presence, once so dominating, now felt like a distant memory, fading into the past with every passing day. Clara had done what many thought impossible. She had claimed her rightful inheritance, and in doing so had restored more than just the estate. She had restored a legacy, her mother's legacy. The key that had once seemed like a mere trinket had turned out to be the key to far more than wealth. It had been the key to a future, to a purpose she had never truly understood until now. With the vault now open, Clara found herself standing on the precipice of something new, something that her mother would have been proud of, something her father would have wished for her. The fortune, hidden away for so long, had been a testament to her mother's kindness, a wealth that had not been intended for greed or self-indulgence, but for the betterment of others. And now it was in Clara's hands. It was a cold morning when Clara made her decision. She could feel the weight of the wealth in her hands, yet it did not burden her. It empowered her. It gave her the freedom to act, the freedom to shape the world around her in a way her mother had once dreamed of. Her mother had never sought wealth for herself. She had given it away, used what little they had to help those in need. Clara now understood that this fortune, this inheritance, was never meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared, just as her mother had shared everything she had. Clara immediately set to work. She restored the family estate, not with lavishness or extravagance, but with care and humility. The mansion was repainted, the gardens tended to, and the rooms refurnished not in a way that showed off her newfound wealth, but in a way that honored the memory of the home her mother had once nurtured. But Clara did not stop there. The wealth her mother had been promised was more than just material. It was a legacy of love, compassion, and kindness, and Clara intended to live up to it. She set aside a portion of the fortune to fund orphanages in nearby villages, to feed the hungry, and to offer shelter to those who had nowhere to turn. The estate, once a symbol of the stepmother's cruel control, was now a beacon of hope for the less fortunate. Clara was not just rebuilding a home, she was rebuilding a future for those who had none. The wealth that had once been used to further her stepmother's ambitions was now being used for the good of others. The Christmas tree that had once stood as a symbol of loss and sorrow now stood as a symbol of hope and renewal. It was no longer the faded relic of a forgotten time, but a living, breathing reminder of everything her mother had been. Clara had placed it in the drawing room, right where it had once stood during her childhood, though now it was adorned not with the faded ornaments of the past, but with new decorations, each one carefully chosen to reflect her mother's values. Every year, Clara would light the tree on Christmas Eve, just as her mother had done, and she would invite the local villagers to join her in a feast. There was no grand display of wealth, no lavish celebration. The food was simple, the atmosphere warm and welcoming, and the guests always left with a full stomach and a sense of belonging. Clara had never known the extent of her mother's influence, but now, as she stood before the tree, surrounded by the people her mother had helped, she realized just how far-reaching that legacy had been. Her mother had touched so many lives, and now Clara was carrying that legacy forward. The key that had once opened the vault was now a symbol of the power she held, not just the power of wealth, but the power of compassion and love. It was a power that could not be measured in gold or jewels, but in the lives it touched and the hearts it healed. As Clara stood in the drawing room, gazing at the tree, she allowed herself a moment to reflect on her journey. It had been a long and difficult road, one filled with loss, betrayal, and pain. She had lost her mother at a young age, and her father, though kind, had been too weak to protect her from the cruelty of her stepmother. For years, Clara had lived in the shadows, believing that her future was controlled by forces beyond her reach. But now, as she looked around the estate, she saw something different. She saw a home that was alive again, filled with warmth and love. She saw a future where her mother's values, kindness, compassion, and generosity were not just remembered, but actively practiced. And she saw herself strong, determined, and empowered, no longer the passive victim of circumstance, but the architect of her own destiny. The Christmas tree, once a symbol of sorrow, had become a symbol of all that she had overcome. The key, once a mere trinket, had unlocked not just a vault, but a future, and the inheritance that had once seemed like a burden had become a tool for good, a means to carry her mother's legacy forward into a new generation. Clara's journey had not been easy. It had been filled with pain, with moments of doubt and despair, but it had also been filled with triumph, with the realization that no matter how difficult life became, she could always choose to rise above it. She could always choose to honor her mother's memory, to live by the values her mother had instilled in her, and to carry that legacy into the world. Every year, as the tree stood proudly in the drawing room, Clara would remember the lessons her mother had taught her. The tree, though just a simple decoration, was now a reminder of the love and kindness that had once filled this home, and which Clara had restored. It was a symbol of what had been lost, but also of what had been reclaimed, a family, a home, and a future. In the years that followed, Clara continued to use her inheritance to help those in need. The estate became a center for charity, and Clara's name was spoken with respect and admiration throughout the region. She had taken the wealth that had been given to her not out of greed, but out of a desire to do good in the world, and in doing so, she had honored the memory of her mother in the best way possible. The Christmas tree, adorned with new ornaments each year, stood as a living testament to the power of legacy, to the enduring nature of love, and to the possibility of redemption. Clara had reclaimed her inheritance, not as a means of personal gain, but as a means of making the world a better place, just as her mother had always done. Thank you for watching Clara's incredible journey of strength, determination, and the reclaiming of her legacy. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with others who might need a reminder of the power of kindness, justice, and hope. Subscribe to the channel for more captivating tales of courage and transformation, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. What part of Clara's journey inspired you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and share your thoughts on how the legacy of kindness can change the world. Stay tuned for more stories that will ignite your heart and spark your own journey of empowerment. Until next time.